Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Timestamps and a full list of the materials I used are in the description. Today we will be painting this magical snow globe with a Christmas tree. Let's get started with the masking fluid. I apply it to every single Christmas light on the Christmas tree itself, and I will be applying it to the snow globe, those areas that I want to preserve white because they are reflections of the light. Using masking fluid just makes it easier for me to preserve some white areas in my painting. Once I'm done painting, I can just rub over it with my finger and it will just come off. I like to use a small wooden stick to apply it because it does destroy brushes. It just sticks to the brushes and you will not be able to remove it completely. The wooden stick has a flat surface and when I'm done I can just peel it off. The masking fluid will take 15 to 20 minutes to dry. Let's use masking tape for this project. I really like the look of having a white border around the painting, and it will give it a larger contrast because I'm using quite intense colors on the snow globe. I do not tape it down onto a surface or the table because I want to turn it back and forth while I'm painting, and I'm also not worried about the paper bulging too much because I will not be working with a lot of water here. This background will be painted using the wet in wet technique. I'm using a mop brush to apply water to the background and let it sink in for a moment. Then I reapply water if needed. The goal is to get an evenly wet surface without puddles. I'm leaving a little gap between the water and the line drawing. It will make it easier to create straight lines and have clean edges. For the background, I'm always starting with the lightest color first. Here I apply some blue and I close the gap that I left earlier between the water and my line drawing. The blue pigment will bleed into all the wet areas. Sometimes I need to help it to get in the right direction by pushing it with my brush or applying more. I'm working rather fast here, because if I apply the blue pigment to an area that's already too dry, it will leave patterns and it will not bleed into each other perfectly. In order to darken up some areas, I'm going to add some more pigment. For example, the top of the snow globe, all the pigment I added bled into the background, so I'm just adding more pigment. Keep in mind, watercolor is always lighter when it dries. If I want to add more pigment and an area is all ready to dry, I can add some more water to that area and then redistribute the pigment this way. You can also drop in some water to create blooms. The water will move the pigment out of the way and it will leave a really cool round pattern. The reason why I'm only using one color for the background is simple. I do not want the eye to be taken away by the busy background from that really beautiful Christmas tree that I'm going to paint. It would also look too crazy having so many colors in this one painting. I want the background to accent the actual piece that I'm painting and not to take all the attention away from it. Once the background is dry, I'm using a really light wash with a really light blue to color in all the glass around the edges of the snow globe. Please don't be too worried about staying within the lines. We will be coloring in the inside of the snow globe later on anyway, so it's just a waste of time. I'm just making sure to add some more water to the inside of the snow globe if I don't stay within the lines to create soft edges. Hard edges, those random lines, will be visible later on and they will be hard to remove. Light would be reflecting differently in the glass of the snow globe, so I'm dropping in some more pigments in some of those areas just to give it some more variations in color. The area that the Christmas tree is standing on is white snow, so I'm careful about adding too much pigment there. This light wash of blue dries pretty fast, so let's move on to coloring in the base of the snow globe. The base will have two different colors. The top and the bottom area will be colored in yellow ochre and then become this really warm golden brown, and the middle of it will be a warm medium dark brown. I will be applying the watercolor to the entire area. Please keep in mind that you're working wet and wet here. And then I will be dropping in some more pigments on each side of the base. These areas lay in the shadow and therefore they are darker. It will be easier to darken them up later if you already now consider this and just drop in some more pigment. I let the yellow ochre dry for a minute to avoid bleeding. For the middle section of the base, I'm using a light brown wash. I then drop in some more pigments on the left and right side of that base and let it bleed towards the center. I'm also adding some more pigment to the top and the bottom area of that base and let it bleed. I need to help the pigment bleed into the other areas because of the masking fluid. It obstructs the bleeding a bit and I need to manually move it around a bit more than I normally would. The top and bottom area where the darker brown meets the yellow ochre are also a bit darker. They lay in the shadow, so I drop in some more pigment there. When I added too much pigment to a certain area, like the center of the space, I will be cleaning my brush, dry it off and soak up some of the pigment. Wood usually has some type of natural color variations and sometimes some patterns in it. So don't make this too perfect. You do not want to create a perfectly flat brown surface here. Some color variations and some patterns are completely okay and just make it look more interesting. Let's move on to the Christmas lights. My Christmas lights are going to be blue, red and yellow. I fill my brush with highly pigmented watercolor and then I create a ring around the dots that I created earlier with the masking fluid. Don't worry about the hard edges around the rings at this point, because as soon as this is dry, I will use a damp brush to soften up those edges. Also, don't forget about the Christmas ornament at the very top. I'm not painting any detailed, small, delicate ornament there like a star, because this painting is so small and any details would just be so hard to see. These Christmas lights are so small, they dry really fast. As soon as they are dry enough, I'm using a damp brush to soften up the pigments around the Christmas lights. While doing this, I'm cleaning out my brush very frequently. And especially when I'm changing colors, I need to wash my brush out really properly, because I do not want to mud up any of the colors. Let's add some more color to the painting by defining the shadows on the base. I apply a lighter wash of yellow ochre to the sides of the base where the shadow is, and then I'm dropping in some more pigment. The pigment I'm dropping in will get more and more intense as I see fit. I even use some of the burnt umber that I used for the center part of the base. If this turns out to be too light in the end, you can always add another layer later on once this is completely dry. Here I'm also working around the masking fluid. The pigment doesn't bleed across the masking fluid as it represents a barrier. So I need to move my brush a little bit more just to make it bleed. How much you want to soften up your shadows, like the wet and wet technique, that's really a matter of taste. The watercolor will only bleed in those areas that are wet or at least a bit moist. You can use this knowledge to create some more patterns on the base. The center part of the base is pretty large, so I will work in sections and not do the entire area at a time. I first add some dark pigment and then I go in with a moist wet brush and allow the pigment to bleed in the areas where I just dropped in the water. It just gives me greater control of where the pigment is and where the pigment will go. It's easier to do it this way, especially because I'm working around the masking fluid. There are many ways to paint a Christmas tree. I went for the dapping method. I'm filling my brush with pigment and then I'm just dapping on the area that I want to be green or greenish. I'm leaving gaps between my dots and I reload my brush in order to get a variation in how intense the dots will be that I'm adding to the tree. I will also be going over it one more time once it's dry and one more time while it's still wet, with a different amount of pigment in my brush, just to give it a lot of variation. This will not create a very realistic tree, but that's really not what I want to create here. If you use this method and you want there to be snow on the branches of your tree, you can add it later on with some white gouache or another type of acrylic paint. Let's color in the Snowglobe. I wetten the area that I'm about to paint first and then I drop in the pigment. This gives me a longer time to work with the pigment and makes it easier for me. Working in sections really pays off here because the water dries pretty fast on the Snowglobe and I have a longer time to work if I wetten an area first. I'm always wettening an area that is larger than the area that I plan to use the pigment on at this point, because it helps me to have soft edges on the sides of the area that I'm painting on. In order to get some more movement and interest in this painting, I'm also dropping in some Prussian blue on the sides of that Snowglobe. I didn't see my line and I colored in the area that the snowman is standing on that was supposed to be white snow. Not a big deal, I mop it up with a paper towel and I will be dealing with it in a bit. Yep, and I didn't see that line either. Those hard edges between the blue pigment and the green Christmas tree, I kind of leave them on purpose on this point because I do not want the blue to bleed into the Christmas tree. I will be dealing with them later by softening them up. Leaving a bit of white space there just increases the contrast in the painting, which makes it look even nicer. Once the painting is completely dry, I can fix those areas that I accidentally painted in earlier. I'm using a damp brush to soften up the pigment and then I soak it up with a paper towel. I also use that damp brush to soften up some of the areas around the Christmas tree. I will be using a light layer of really light blue to create some more movement on the white snow. If you want to paint white objects in watercolors, they are never completely white. Snow might have shadows from a rock or reflections from a green Christmas tree, or some of the grass might be shining through. So this is what you can paint in: shadows and reflections from other objects. Since the inside of my Snowglobe is kind of dry at the time, I'm going back in with some more pigment to intensify that area. I can also straighten up some of my lines there. When I intensify the color around the edges of the Snowglobe, I'm always softening them. I'm just using a wet brush and I drop in some water to give the watercolor an area where it can bleed into. The shadows on the base of the Snowglobe came out way too light. So let's add some more pigment. Let's drop in some dark pigment, allow it to bleed and see how it looks. In order to make this painting really pop, those shadows need to be really intensified. Intense shadows make it easier for the eye to see that this is a round object because those areas lay in the shadow. So don't be afraid to darken them up a lot. Leaving some brush strokes visible on here can look really cool, but it's a matter of taste. All the brush strokes at this point need to go in the direction of the curve of the base. So they need to have a light bend downwards in the center, and they need to go upwards towards the end of it. They never go up and down, they always go horizontally. Those segments of the snow globe curve inwards where they meet, so I need to darken that area as well. The very base of the snow globe, where it is meeting the table, where it's standing on the table, that lays in the shadow as well, so I need to darken that area somewhat. The Christmas tree is dry now, so I can go in with an even darker green and add some dots here and there, just to add some more color variations in the tree. Like I said, watercolor is always lighter once it dried, so I'm adding some more blue pigments to that base area of the snow. It also increases the color variation towards the glass. It was hard to see before how dark that area needs to be, but now that I really darkened up the shadows on the base and the background on the Christmas tree area, I can see how dark this should go. Let's soften up some of those hard edges around the lights, especially the light in the top. I'm using a wet brush and drop in some water just to soften up some of the pigment, and then I can move it around. Once I softened up those hard edges, it's easy to see that some of the areas should have more pigment or should be darker. This area is really a matter of contrast. You need to increase the contrast from the background to your bright lights to make the lights really pop. When your background is really dark, your light yellow light will simply pop even more. It's finally time to remove the masking tape, and those edges really came out clean. Well, now I need to use my finger to rub over the masking fluid to remove it. It just feels like rubber, and it comes off pretty easy. In some areas, those reflections that I created by using masking fluid did not turn out as straight and perfect as I would like them to be. So I'm just using a damp brush and I'm moving the pigment around a bit just to crispen up those edges. There is absolutely no pigment in my brush, except maybe the one I just picked up from another area. It's time for the messy part. I cut a hole in some paper towel to protect the other areas of my painting, and I laid down a lot of newspaper and other paper towel around the painting because this can be messy. Then I added some gouache to my tray and mixed it with a little bit of water. I'm using a toothbrush to spread the snowflakes on the snow globe. I did not fully mix the water and gouache before, so that my white gouache mix has different consistencies. The snowflakes that I'm splashing on the page using a toothbrush vary in transparency due to that. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you liked it, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and please leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought of my video.